let's get on with the show. It's time for our opening panel to discuss what is Mad Studies, which I will be moderating with Brad Lewis. And I'm so pleased to introduce to you the four amazing panelists that we have to talk about what Mad Studies means to them and how they use it in their lives. So today we have Alisha Ali, who you just met, who is one of the co-editors of the Mad Studies Reader. She's also an associate professor at NYU's Department of Applied Psychology, where she leads the Advocacy and Community-Based Trauma Studies, that's ACTS lab. Her research focuses on the mental health effects of oppression, including racism and poverty. We also have Debbie Ann Chambers, who is a licensed counseling psychologist, poetry therapy practitioner, and cultural therapist. She's provided community mental health services in Jamaica for over a decade, and currently she's a psychologist at the University of the West Indies, Mona, applying liberation and arts-based methods to mental health care. We also have Sascha DuBrul, who's the co-founder of the Icarus Project, a network and media project dedicated to redefining the language and culture of mental health and illness. He holds a master's from Silberman School of Social Work and worked as a recovery specialist at Columbia Center for Practice Innovations. He now maintains a public/private practice. And we have Leah Harris, who's a mad queer and disabled writer, facilitator, and advocate. Their work focuses on autonomy and choice, surveillance and tech in mental health, the history of the carceral mental health system and psychiatric abolition. Their writing has been featured in the progressive magazine Mad in America and anthologies like We've Been Too Patient. So, to kick us off with our first question, as we can already see through the diversity of work thus far, Mad Studies is quite an evolving and emerging field. And as such, there's really no solid definition, and it can be described in many different ways. So, what does Mad Studies mean to each of you?
I'm just going to jump in because given the group of polite, deferential people that we tend to be, I figure I'm just going to talk first. It's so exciting to think about this question because I feel that as an academic, to me, Mad Studies is a way to connect what we do in academia with what goes on in social justice movements, because we tend to look the other way and feel like, well, they need to be learning from us. And so could kind of expose and subvert the privileges that academia rests upon is such an exciting idea, initiative, endeavor. And that is the core of it to me, because, we're invested in these forms of privilege, not over, like the idea of like north, south, what color are you, have not. If you're a poor person, or you're allowed into academia if you have enough resources, but you're not allowed into academia if you don't. All these sort of gatekeeping measures that we've built into the academy, it kind of exposes really our own fear of the things that we don't know about and that we're not comfortable about. So I think it's really about embracing being uncomfortable. And also just, I feel like there's this idea that when we are the ones who decide, who determines what topics matter, it means we also are the ones who determine what people matter and which people don't matter. And it's about time that we realize that we have to kind of talk our walk. We say equality, we see diversity. We're so good at throwing these labels around. I think what Mad Studies does is it forces us as scientists, as scholars, to say, let's take a step back and just take in information, as opposed to assuming we're the only ones who have something useful to say.
I can also jump in here. I'm Leah. I am a white Ashkenazi Jewish person with short curly brown hair and brown eyes, and I have some books behind me. Yeah, I really resonate with how you're describing this, Alisha, and my answer to this question really also involved the attempts of Mad Studies to flip power dynamics or to subvert power dynamics. And I think so much about how we have historically been the ones to be studied and researched by people who sought to understand us or fix us or help us in ways that some of us don't find especially helpful. And so to me, Mad Studies is kind of this hopeful expression that we're no longer willing to just be these subjects of examination or fascination or curiosity, but to really study and critique the institutions that oppress us, that oppress all marginalized groups, and to really highlight, right, these issues of power and control and the carceral nature that is so inherent to systems, right? And that, to me, I think beyond just psychiatry, but right, all systems of oppression, all forms of social neglect, organized abandonment, to use a term from Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and so I just really see Mad Studies as uplifting and embracing mad knowledges and mad wisdoms that kind of defy the kind of epistemic injustice that we've all been under. And then, yeah, just the last thing I would say about it is that I feel like Mad Studies really allows for this multiplicity of knowing and experience that I feel is tremendously like more needed than ever, right, in these times of ecocide, genocide, and collapse. So that's what I have to say.
Thanks. So I will follow up with Leah. So this is Debbie Ann speaking. She, her. I am a Black Jamaican woman with short Black curly hair, and I'm sitting in my apartment. So just ditto to what Alisha and Leah have said in terms of Mad Studies allowing us to embrace our humanity in all its complexity. That's very important for me. Acknowledging that there are systems that have negated our personhood, whether they're historical systems, social systems, economic systems, political systems, right, that have reduced us to the binaries, as we've talked about. And then I think personally for me, as a descendant of enslaved Africans, living in a country that was colonized for hundreds of years, it's a questioning of sanity. So the question of, well, why was that sane or considered sane for my ancestors to be enslaved, brought over, for genocidal violence? We don't seem to question that enough. And so Mad Studies allows and creates a space where we can really talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie and Leah and Alisha. So my name is Sascha, and I'm a white man. And there's I have a whole bunch of books and posters and stuff behind me. I'm sitting in my office in Los Angeles, California. I just want to say, just that, like, as part of the way I'm going to answer this question is just, I feel so honored to be here with you all. I'm like just overflowing with a sense of camaraderie and a sense of like, wow, boy, this book and this organization and this gathering just represents so much work. And so what I'll add to the what I'll add to the conversation is that when I think of Mad Studies, part of it, and I borrow this language from Brad Lewis, is this language of, are we going to use pathological narratives or are we going to use celebratory narratives? And I feel like as someone who got diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a teenager and that spent a lot of time locked up in psychiatric hospitals, for me, there's a real loneliness to madness. There's a real like, am I the only person out here who feels like how I'm feeling? And then when you find other people who are like you, it's like the best medicine, And I would just say that my trajectory as someone who was like a young mad person who then was part of starting the Icarus Project and then ended up working in the public mental health system, having access to a plethora of narratives, a polyphony of ideas, that just step way outside the bounds of the dominant biomedical framework has, it's sustained me for many years, and it's what I carry around with me that helps me do the work that I do in the world. And I don't know, as I've been making my way through the Mad Studies reader, I'm just like, man, I got some really good company. And I just props to all y'all that put the work in to make this happen and to make this conversation happen. Thank you.
What do you, then this got answered in many ways, like what does Mad Studies mean to you? How would you put into words what it adds to our capacity to think and organize in this domain? I mean, what gap is Mad Studies filling that is missing? How would you try to put that into words?
Leah, I'm glad to speak to that. I think Mad Studies to me, it's a means of challenging the biomedical model and the eugenicist and sanist kinds of views of madness and mental health that have persisted throughout culture, science, and society. And when I first got involved in movement work about 25 years ago in the US, I think a lot of us thought and hoped that the recovery movement would be that challenge, right, to the medical model and its assumptions. But, I think what's called the recovery movement at this point has been, so co-opted by the system and state and government agencies. And I'm speaking specifically to my country. So while like some great alternatives to the mainstream do now exist in places, it's pretty clear that the recovery movement is not the liberation movement. I think that some of us hoped it would be 25 years ago. I think the hypothesis was that like peer support and lived experience would change the system from within. But that hypothesis hasn't, in my opinion, aged particularly well. So, I guess that's really where I see the MAD movement and the MAD studies movement, however we want to call this, kind of coming in and really like mounting that challenge that never really took, right? And also kind of moving beyond like the recovery model really perpetuated such a like neoliberal kind of respectability politics, right? Like the picture of the recovered person, being this polite, cis, law-abiding person who pays their taxes on time, has a full-time job, and is a homeowner, right? So these kind of, I really want, and I see Mad Studies challenging, right, these neoliberal, capitalistic kinds of ideas of what it means to recover, right? And to like allow the non-respectability mads to like take the mic and flourish and step forward in this work. So that's some of it. I think the need is really just that some of the efforts at opposition have been very co-opted, and we need something new that can bring forth the kind of challenge we really need at these times.
I want to add to that because that was beautiful, Leah, what you just said, because I think those of us who for a long time have been parts of different liberatory movements, we have a sense of frustration. And when you bridge different worlds, the academic world, the activist world, etc., you realize that there's, academia is, there's this feeling of like sort of, to me, like a phoniness, a betrayal of like humanity and truth, because we pretend that it's all about ideas and that we don't have feelings, that we don't make a misstep because we are allowed to be the people who make sure things are polished and perfect before we put it out there in the world. And we're the ones who, write about, and as you say, Leah, we get to study other people. And so we're so obviously complicit in this process of othering. And it's not, when we say different, let's face it, we mean, not as good as other people. I mean, that's really, really what we mean. And so it's a way of silencing entire communities and entire realities. And so for me, there's a huge need because we have to backtrack. We need to really get back to understanding who we are as human beings. And that's one of the things I love about the book is that it's sort of like placing on equal footing scholars with artists, with activists, with clinicians, and also understanding that no one is ever just one of those things. And so realizing that we are our fullest selves when we look at the interconnections with others, with other communities, and within ourselves. And so I think that process of humanizing is much needed. And so Mad Studies is essential for that reason. And then also being, a scholar in the North, the very North, because I'm Canadian, I kind of feel like we need to sort of start to take a back seat ideologically as well and look at the damage that we've done. Debbie, you and I have talked about this. I did much of my postdoctoral fellowship at University of the West Indies, and being a Canadian funded scholar doing postdoctoral work there, it was so interesting because, when in the 80s and 90s, when there were all of these, women's studies departments and programs opening up, Canada, the US, and Europe, we were allowed to just say, oh, we do, women's studies. But because funding for a lot of these programs in the global South came partly from the North, I noticed that at University of the West Indies, it wasn't called gender studies, it was called gender and development studies. And that's not like human development as in like age span or lifespan development. It was actually development as in you are in an underdeveloped country. We needed to have a name there that reminded people in the Caribbean, in this case, that you have less, therefore you do less, you have less to say, you have less to contribute to the academic discourse. And what did it mean? It means that the work that was allowed to come out, these just incredible scholars doing just astounding work intellectually and in every way, they always had to build in, I found, a language around development. So it was kind of like what I thought is a sort of like hands in the mud feminism. So here's the ideas, but like, how are you going to use it to get more clean water to your poorest villages? How are you going to use this so that you have, more food or whatever it is? And so we pretend that there's no one in our countries like Canada and the US where people, there are no people who are starving, there are no people who are going without safety and food. And so I feel like these divides, like that's just one example, the North-South divide, is so important for us to just step back a little and become just tone down our arrogance, because it's really so pervasive in so much of our work.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll add to that. I think, as I was listening to everybody, the image that came to mind, a mentor of mine, ancestor, Professor Frederick Hickling, worked in the quote unquote asylum in Jamaica. And he engaged the patients there with art and drama. Right. And they would often go on tours, and they had a community theater where people in the community were invited to witness. And the community had this great debate about who was quote unquote mad and who wasn't, because the clinicians would also participate in the drama, which was really allowed for this reflexivity, right, about what we understand as madness. And I'm contributing that to the gap because for me, as somebody who loves liberation psychology, as others have mentioned, I also had to question who I thought had a right to be in that movement of liberation psychology, and didn't question for my own self, like, wait a minute. I'm thinking of people who are quote unquote sane, right? And that was a huge gap missing in my liberation work, which was filled by this mentorship of transcultural psychiatrist. And just ditto to everything Alisha has said, I could go on for days about the reality here in the global South, as we're called. And how even movements that are aimed towards whether liberation, progression, so on, exile some of our own experiences here, right? Which can be quite a disorienting experience. So those are some of the gaps I'm thinking about as I sit here. Thank you.
So this question of filling in the gaps, I mean, there's so much to say, but if I could summarize, for a very long time now, like 20 plus years, I feel like I've been working with people trying to figure out how to really flip the script. Like how do we take something that is so broken and turn it into something that is actually going to be liberatory for people? And you know, a lot of it's been hard along the way. I mean, when I worked at the New York State Psychiatric Institute for 3 years, which is like the most powerful psychiatric institute in the world. And I don't think I ever got such a strong feeling of like, wow, the system was really not set up to heal people. It was really set up to separate the mad people from everybody else. So what do you do with that? You know? Well, you get creative, and I think there's this metaphor that we've been using for years, talking about the relationship between the underground and the
Do you
mainstream.
like fit
You
it
know,
through the window or do you carry it around?
oh, wait, I'm hearing voices.
Sascha, we all heard that. I just want to interject that. And I'm not saying that because I think it matters, but I'm just saying it as a piece of information.
All right, good. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. No, I was being a bit facetious, but cool. So the the underground and the mainstream. It's basically the idea that like Leah was talking about with the recovery movement, basically once something becomes mainstream, it's very hard to keep it something that is actually gonna it gets watered down, it gets co-opted. It's the nature of the system to co-opt things that are, you know, that have power. And so there's this idea that we can do things in the underground, in the cultural underground, that we can't do in the mainstream. And in many ways, I feel like I don't know, when I look at when I think about these conversations, well, I'll say one anecdote and then and leave it there. When I was in social work school, I was like in night school at you know, Silberman, and it was a very interesting experience. I felt like an anthropologist more than a something else. I was like, oh, this is how you socialize clinicians to be clinicians. And one night I was in my clinical 3 class and I walked in and the professor was like, okay, tonight we're going to talk about borderline personality disorder. And I was like, all right, here we go. And I remember sitting there, you know, with my laptop and getting on Facebook and being like, yo, people, like they're talking about borderline personality disorder in my clinical 3 class. And within, you know, 15 minutes, there was people from all over the world chiming in, talking about like people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, talking about their experiences. And I reflect back on that, thinking about the power of people's lived experience in the face of training people who are then going off to go do work. And I don't know, that was the same year that, you know, Jazz and Peter met and we decided to start IDHA. And I think about that and I think about Mad Studies, and that's my answer for you. I feel like there's tangible ways people can have conversations that can then like get in there and affect how we're training. And I see a lot of that happening in the work we're doing.
Thanks, Sasha. And +1 to what everyone has said so far. I just want to chime in about this need for mad studies because, you know, one might argue like, well, we already have critical psychiatry, critical psychology. Why do we need mad studies? Or, you know, we already have philosophy of mental health or medical anthropology or, you know, the Mad Pride movement already exists. Why do we need mad studies? And I think it seems to me that mad studies is taking a really kind of big tent approach. It doesn't matter what your specialty is. It doesn't matter, you know, whether you're an activist or a scholar or a person with lived experience. You know, the problem with sometimes some of these like sub-disciplines is that they carry on like the lineage and also the set of assumptions and set of values that particular field and discipline has. And Mad Studies is, I think, kind of is developing its own method. It's starting with madness itself as a method, with lived experiencers as the teachers and the wisdom holders and the knowledge producers. And therefore, themes that I think are really siloed out or not allowed in some of these other subdisciplines are allowed in Mad Studies. We really welcome that multiplicity. And as someone myself, I really, utilize in the way that I think about myself and madness in general and what I've experienced, I draw on so many different frameworks, really kind of refusing to choose just one, because I think that kind of multiplicity is really important because we can't really give our consent to treatment without really seeing beyond the dominant narratives that we've grown up with. So just wanted to add that piece.
Well, I mean, just to build on that, like, yeah, it does seem like, and we've talked about the sort of conversations that, in the little pocket of NYU. And a big part of what made that possible is we were outside the disciplines. I think disciplines create a sort of mind-forged manacles that predetermine in advance what kinds of questions you can ask and therefore what kinds of answers you can have. And once you get set out of that box, you look at it from this way and 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 this way. You see all kinds of dynamics that are otherwise lost, and you put people together that are already coming from just one point of view, and all of a sudden it just starts to open up, and we need to get more people in. I mean, even the language, right? So like the language mental illness, right? It's already framed it so powerfully that this is an illness. We're talking about a difference, and we're talking about an illness, and that it's in our mouths, it's in our minds before we even trying to. It's affecting our thinking before we even get a chance to think. But then mad, like that word sort of has emerged through activist groups, it's emerged through writers and artists, it's emerged through interdisciplinary scholars, but then it's not like it's a perfect word. Like, how are you all feeling about the word mad, about the language of trying to organize more broadly here across different disciplines outside of the academy into the arts? How are you feeling about the word mad as an organizing language?
I'm glad to jump in and share some thoughts on this. Yeah, I think I can speak to my personal experience with this, is that for a very long time, just given the conditioning of society and everything, I really feared openly identifying as mad, right? I'd seen what had happened to my parents, who died very young as a result of their madness. And there was just some real existential fear about it, even though, of all the various identities and ways of describing myself, madness has always fit best. And I think, yeah, I eventually really kind of claimed my identity as a mad person in a very intentional way. And yeah, I understand that no term is going to be perfect, specifically within the context of madness. That is kind of breaking apart all of these disciplines and undisciplining everything. But I think it's so expansive, and as so many folks have already said, but it just encompasses this multiplicity of meaning and resisting the binaries like we've been talking about. And I really view the word mad, or like the condition of madness, as a form of non-binariness of another sort, right? To me, it's a fluidity of the mind and the in-between spaces of the mind, and like the ability to exist in, for some of us, multiple timelines and multiple realities at once, not just the consensus ones that we are taught to expect as real, right? So I think how that influences the way Mad Studies evolves, like, I hope it's chaotic. I hope it's undisciplined, I hope it's something that doesn't look like anything that's really come before. So yeah, I think that's some of what I have to say on that. I'll leave it there.
I love that, Leah, like the idea of, consensus versus polyphony. And again, what we're comfortable with and what we don't allow ourselves to be comfortable with. And yes, I think of the term mad, and there's a lot attached to it that feels like fear for different people. Sometimes it's about fearing things in ourselves, and for a lot of people, when we do the work that we do, it's about fearing others, like, oh, you might disrupt things in a way that sort of causes this perfect looking house of cards to just, you know, fall apart, and then where are we? And so we have this idea of progress, and that moving forward is, you know, is this unidirectional idea that we have to progress to bigger, better, and it's somehow the better ends up seeming more pristine and just cutting away of other things and cutting away the messiness. And I feel like the term mad implies a messiness and just like sitting within that mess, which in and of itself is a liberatory practice, I think. And then, you know, as a feminist scholar, Brad, Jazz, the three of us have talked about this idea that, you know, mad is also used to, you know, imply anger. And so in the feminist movement, so much of what we've tried to do is just understand what it can mean to allow women to be angry and express anger, because that's not allowed. That's a terrifying, disruptive thing to the world, for women to acknowledge anger and show that anger. And so, you know, the work that I do, like I've worked with, you know, obviously women who've experienced different forms of trauma and abuse and have been told that the anger has to be sort of treated away, neutralized. And now we have ways to chemically neutralize women's anger, which is, you know, such a way of completely silencing them, because women are not even allowed to know that their anger is there if it's been chemically medicalized away. And so there's so much risk attached to that chemical neutralization of feelings. And then, you know, most of my work now is with military veterans. So veterans who've experienced military sexual trauma, male and female veterans. And then also just, you know, every veteran, when I think about, you know, anger and aggression, we train them to be, you know, what we say is the greatest military that that history of civilization have ever seen. And we teach them to embrace their anger so that they can be fighting machines and go do what they've been trained to do. And yet in the world of combat, in the world of military service, the things that keep them alive, keep their comrades alive, and are adaptive in that environment, they come back to the civilian world, and those same things, the hypervigilance, the anger, the aggression, we say, oh, those are symptoms of psychiatric illness. And so this is how context shapes the way that we define and perceive things. And so you're doing what you were trained to do, and you were angry and you had aggression, great. Now you're back, and those same things are signs of illness. And so with women who've been abused, military veterans, these different groups, across all of these groups, the things that we fear, we project our fears onto them, and we distance them by saying, you're mentally ill, and therefore we don't have to take your feelings, your thoughts, your realities seriously, because that's the power of the labels that we've created. So there's a lot of danger, I think, involved in that. And so using the term mad just opens up all of that and saying, well, let's just try and see what happens if we can be mad together in all our different ways of doing madness.
So I can follow up on that. I think what I'm hearing, or what settles within me from Leah and Alisha, is the fear and liberation, right? And so if I think about myself as a young child growing up in Jamaica, madness, to be called mad or deemed mad, was something frightful, a place you don't want to go. You were exiled or incarcerated. But in some ways, people would often think of people who are considered mad in Jamaica, we say mad as demon possessed. So it was just a place you didn't want to be. But as I've thought of my own evolution, and I must admit, some of that may still be within me, because I have to own my own I guess what I've inherited culturally, and constantly question that and think about that and analyze that for myself. But as I think about, I guess, my walk to my own liberation, again, thinking of my mentor who would say, own your madness. The freedom that comes from owning that messiness, as Alisha said, and that complexity as human beings. And that has helped me, I think, in my own clinical practice, because I'm owning the parts of me exiled by culture, society, family, whatever. And so I think I can better sit with the parts of persons exiled too. I would say one thing that comes to mind, I remember sitting with a young woman some time ago who was diagnosed by the system as having bipolar disorder. And we would talk a lot. I really enjoy talking with people, very creative, and I'm a poetry therapist, so that was really, and we were talking, and she said to me, none of the psychologists have asked me about my trauma. I'm coming in, yes, I know I have these delusions and they're based in sexual trauma. Nobody has asked me if I've ever been traumatized. I've never forgotten that conversation, and how our labeling people as ill says, okay, what medication, what putting you away is going to solve, quote unquote, that illness, rather than, let's have a conversation. I own the madness in me, you own the madness in you, and let's see what comes of that when we sit together. So yeah.
Thank you, Debbie. Debbie, I'm actually still stuck back on the last comment you made when you were talking about your mentor and the theater where everyone got out together in the public and it was like, who's crazy, who's not. There's a very practical, on some level, like when I think about like the interventions that we did early on with the Icarus Project, like what we did, because we were really outside the system. And it turned out that like we were doing stuff that really was helping people because we would have these events and anyone could come and you'd be there and you'd be like, oh, is that person crazy? Is that person just like a weird artist? Is that person just, like whatever? And that was very powerful what we did. And that was something that was very hard for, like, I don't know, the other organizations in New York City where we were like organizing like Fountain House or whatever, where where it was just like everyone had this identity of, okay, so there's a real power, like like you all are saying, like Alicia's saying, in opening up the space around what, what's, are we talking about individuals or are we talking about society? What's the madness? I feel like that's like a critical piece, right? And I wrote down, Alisha said, we don't have to take you seriously. Yeah. So like, that's the thing that happens to people like us, like they're like, oh, that guy's just crazy. He's just crazy. You don't have to take him seriously. And in recent years, in a lot of my work as a therapist, I'm very inspired not only by internal family systems, but by the history of systemic family therapy. And there was this guy, Gregory Bateson, who came up with the double bind theory of schizophrenia, which was basically saying like, someone's acting in a strange way. Is there something inherently wrong with them, or is there something about the system that they're in? Or is there something about the family that they're in, and they happen to be sensitive about it? And those are the kind of questions you can ask when, that are very hard to ask in a traditional mental health environment. The last thing I will say, just to add to the conversation, because there's so much, this is such a rich question, it really makes me reflect on the Icarus Project. And what we tried to do with the organization was, at some point, we were an organization that was started by white people. And then we were like, we really want to not be such a white-centered, focused organization. And so we did our best to try and bring lots of different voices together, and what the Icarus Project is now, transitioned to something called the Fireweed Collective, which is a, queer trans people of color run organization. totally different thing going on. But part of the conflicts that we would get into trying to get together in groups and talk about this stuff is because we had such different social locations. What it meant for me as a white man to talk about my madness coming from playing in a punk rock band was really different if I was a Black woman, or if I, like, and so I just think that those are just like on a practical level, when you're talking about organizing around with people and talking about identity and trying to figure out how to talk, like, they're really important conversations. So that's that.
Beautiful. Thank you all. We only have a few more minutes for this last question, but if anyone wants to shout out something around what their vision is for the future of Mad Studies, I think it would be really lovely to end on that note.
I can come in on that, Jazmine, with just so much appreciation for everything that's been shared in this panel. Yeah, just briefly, I would like to see Mad Studies really move beyond the academy, or in and outside, and kind of, not have the academy be the center, I guess, but have the academy just be one part of that movement. That's a movement for mad liberation and mad justice. I think a lot about some of the early folks in the US and how like disruptive they were. And I'd love to see Mad Studies embrace that kind of disruption of the status quo. And yeah, I hope the MAD movement will help amplify the forms of mutual aid that we have all been learning and practicing to keep each other out of the systems, to keep each other as safe as possible. And yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is I just hope that Mad Studies can help make systems obsolete. I would really love to see a MAD movement that could do that.
Yeah, I love that, Leah. What I kind of envision is something where we are able to dismantle the things that so many of us were part of building. And so that's about humility, which we're really not good at in academia at all. And so kind of this idea, Foucault has this idea, well, there I said, now I'm talking about Foucault, sorry everyone, but I use Foucault in my work, what can I say? And it translates into disengagement, this idea of sort of like, he wrote about imagine yourself as like an archaeologist of thought, like, a century from now. What practices and systems have we put in place now that many, many decades from now we'll look on and say, I can't believe we subjected people to that. I can't believe we did. I mean, think of it, in the United States, for so long, slavery was just thought of as, well, it has to be that way. Of course, there's no other way. This is a system based on that. And it just makes sense. It simply makes sense to, have slavery as part of what allows our country, our nation to function. What are the things that we're doing and imposing on people right now that 50 100 years from now we will look back on the people who are living and working now and say, how could they be so inhumane to each other, and how could they subject people to that kind of harm? And I really feel like when I think to the future, that's what I think about, because we're doing things right now that when we hurt other people, we're hurting ourselves. And so sort of just redirecting, how can we collectively and thoughtfully redirect?
So Jazmine, we stop at 1:10, is that right?
Yep.
And that's a real stop, right? That's like, anybody want last minute to shout out the future of Mad Studies?
Sure. So I think for me, very short, expanded and altered states of consciousness. I saw that being put in the chat. That's really important, especially where I am in my decolonial process and some of the gifts that we've gotten in Jamaica from our ancestors around expanded states of consciousness and access to different realms. And I think that's something that Mad Studies could help us work towards understanding.
Mm.
Oh boy, how am I going to say this in 10 seconds? This is a very complex thought. It's
That's mad.
it's something about like it's a very practical thought about how groups of people can get together and support each other. I mean, I just have lots of experience of like amazing people coming together, really supporting each other, but then having a hard time keeping it going. And the nature of talking about madness as something that we you know, all identify with can sometimes get in the way of the work that we're doing. So I'm interested. I think sometimes, you know, you can have mad studies and it can do what it's doing, and then it also has to be connected to other things that kind of keep it in check. So I'll leave it at that. I know we're
no, but that's all of that. I mean, it's almost like to organize, you need a signifier, but then the signifier, you know, creates all this sort of division processes. So we need a signifier of no signifier, essentially, to organize with as a rallying cry. And in many ways, MAD has that possibility because it's like, and it's like, oh my God, a mad genius, you know, and a mad, you know, sax player, and, you know, and so on and so forth. It's unstable. And I guess that's what we want to do, is keep it unstable so it becomes a signifier of no signifier where we can organize around the questions like, what's it looking like to you, rather than some sort of predetermined solutions.
Word.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add too, there's a question in the chat there around, is Mad Studies and inherently kind of against psychiatry? And I would say no, Mad Studies positions itself, as Brad has said, against sanism. And so therefore it may be an unpopular opinion, but I would love to see more people who are psychiatrists, neuroscientists, you know, people of many different disciplines. We all know that our medical system needs so much reform. I mean, just believing people's pain and stories, whether that's mental and emotional pain or physical pain, that needs to be completely reworked. And so I think there's some, you know, room there for more people in the mix, and more groups. And I would also love to see Mad Studies connect with leaders and activists worldwide as well. That's already starting, but I would love to see people across the globe engaging in Mad Studies.